The first thing Daniel noticed about the car was how quiet it was. Not the peaceful quiet of a Sunday morning or a sleepy neighborhood. This silence felt expensive. The engine barely hummed, as the sleek black sedan idled at the curb outside the towering glass. Building in downtown Chicago, Daniel Carter sat stiffly behind the steering wheel, his hands gripping it just a little too tightly, afraid that even his fingerprints might somehow damage something that clearly cost more than everything he owned combined. 2 weeks ago, Daniel had been delivering groceries in his dented pickup truck. Now he was a driver for a billionaire, and he still wasn't sure how that happened. It started on a rainy Tuesday, the kind of rain that doesn't pour but refuses to stop. The streets were slick, umbrellas bumped into each other, and everyone in the city seemed irritated by the gray sky. Daniel had just finished dropping his 8-year-old daughter Emma off at school. "Don't forget my science project," she had said, pointing at the cardboard volcano sitting on the passenger seat. "I'll bring it after work," Daniel promised with a smile. Being a single dad meant juggling everything: work, school lunches, laundry, homework, bedtime stories, and the quiet worry that maybe you were still not doing enough. Daniel had been doing food deliveries for 3 different apps just to keep the rent paid. That morning, however, his old pickup truck refused to start. He sat in the driver's seat, turning the key again and again. Nothing. The clock on the dashboard blinked 7:42 a.m. His first delivery was in 18 minutes. "Come on," he whispered to the truck like it was a stubborn horse. The engine coughed once and died. Daniel leaned back and sighed. Somewhere between exhaustion and frustration, he decided to walk to the bus stop and try to salvage the day. That was when he saw the man standing beside a black luxury car across the street. The man looked completely out of place in the rain. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent, but his expression wasn't irritated. It was amused. More importantly, his driver was nowhere to be seen. Daniel watched as the man checked his watch, glanced at his phone, then looked up and down the street. Finally, their eyes met. "You look like a man who knows how to drive," the stranger said with a slight smile. Daniel blinked. "I do." "Good," the man replied. "Because mine apparently forgot how to show up." Daniel laughed awkwardly. "I'm not exactly dressed for chauffeur duty." "You're dressed like someone who needs a job," the man said kindly. Daniel hesitated. He had no idea who this person was, but he also had rent due in 10 days, and Emma needed new shoes. "Just one meeting," the man added. "I'll pay you for your time." Daniel looked at the sleek car, then at the rain, then at his useless truck. "All right," he said. That single decision changed everything. The man introduced himself once they were inside the car. "Victor Langley." Daniel nearly hit the brake. The name was impossible to miss. Victor Langley was one of the wealthiest investors in the country. His companies owned half the skyline. "You've heard of me," Victor said casually. "Yeah, I think everyone has." "Relax," Victor chuckled. "Today you're just my driver." Daniel drove him to 3 meetings that morning. Victor spent most of the rides quietly watching the city pass by. At one point he asked, "So why were you walking in the rain?" "Truck died," Daniel said. "And before that?" "Deliveries." "And before that?" Daniel hesitated. "Construction. Company shut down last year." Victor nodded slowly. "And the science project on your passenger seat?" Daniel smiled. "My daughters." "How old?" 8. Victor leaned back and stared out the window again. When the final meeting ended, Daniel parked the car and handed the keys back. "Thanks for the opportunity," he said. Victor didn't take them. "How much do you make delivering groceries?" he asked. "Depends on the week." "On average." Daniel shrugged. "Maybe 300 if I'm lucky." Victor tapped the steering wheel thoughtfully. "My regular driver just retired." Daniel laughed. "You're joking." "I'm not." "I don't own a suit." "You don't need one to drive." "I've never driven a car like this." "You didn't crash it today." Daniel hesitated again. "I have a daughter." Victor smiled slightly. "Good. That means you already understand responsibility." And just like that, Daniel Carter became the reluctant driver for a billionaire. At first it felt surreal. Daniel expected Victor to be demanding, cold, maybe even arrogant. Instead, the billionaire was surprisingly normal. He liked quiet drives. He tipped waiters generously. He once made Daniel stop the car just to help an elderly woman carry groceries across the street. "Money doesn't make you better than people," Victor said afterward. "It just makes your choices louder." Weeks passed, then months. Daniel drove Victor to boardrooms, airports, charity events, and quiet dinners. But the best part of the job wasn't the salary, it was the time. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't working 3 jobs. He could pick Emma up from school. He could help with homework. He could attend her soccer games. One afternoon, Victor noticed the small drawing taped to the dashboard, a crayon picture of Daniel and Emma holding hands. "Your daughter made that?" he asked. Daniel nodded. "She says I'm her favorite driver." Victor chuckled. "You probably are." But one evening, something unusual happened. Victor asked Daniel to drive somewhere that wasn't on the schedule, a small neighborhood far from the glittering downtown skyline. They stopped in front of a modest brick building. "What is this place?" Daniel asked. "Where I grew up," Victor said quietly. Daniel looked surprised. Victor stared out the window for a long moment. "My father worked 3 jobs. My mother cleaned houses. We barely had enough for food." Daniel turned to him. "I didn't know that. Most people don't." Victor finally looked back at him. "But I remember every person who helped us survive." He nodded toward the building. "Tonight we're going to help someone else." Inside the building was a small community center struggling to stay open. Victor quietly wrote a check that could fund it for years. But before they left, Daniel noticed something. Victor insisted the donation remain anonymous. On the drive home, Daniel asked why. Victor smiled softly. "Because kindness isn't a performance." Daniel thought about that for a long time. Months later, Emma's school announced a fundraiser for new science equipment. The school didn't expect much. The neighborhood was struggling. Daniel mentioned it casually during a drive. Victor listened silently. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the school parking lot to drop Emma off. 3 large trucks were unloading brand-new lab equipment. Teachers stood outside, staring in disbelief. Emma ran inside excitedly. "Daddy, they got microscopes!" "And robots!" Daniel stood there confused. Later that day, Victor handed him a small envelope. Inside was a note. For Emma's curiosity. No signature. Daniel looked up. "You did this?" Victor shrugged. "Maybe." Daniel smiled. "You're going to spoil that kid." Victor's expression softened. Children should grow up believing the world is kind. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. Driving through the city no longer felt like survival. It felt like purpose. He wasn't just working. He was living. One evening as they drove along the lakefront, Victor spoke quietly. "You know why I kept you as my driver?" Daniel glanced in the mirror. "Because I didn't crash the car?" Victor shook his head. "Because when you thought no one important was watching, you were still kind." Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "The first day," Victor said. "When you thought I wasn't looking, you moved a homeless man's cart out of the street so cars wouldn't hit it." Daniel barely remembered doing that. Victor smiled. "That told me everything I needed to know." The city lights reflected across the windshield as they drove through the night. For the first time in a long time, Daniel wasn't worried about rent, or broken trucks, or whether he was failing as a father. Instead, he thought about Emma's laughter, her science projects, her future, and the strange twist of fate that had placed him behind the wheel of a billionaire's car. Sometimes life didn't change with a grand miracle. Sometimes it started with a rainy morning, a broken truck, and one small act of kindness that someone important happened to notice. And for Daniel Carter, those quiet drives through the city had become the best days of his life.